As we head into the final month of winter, February 2025, we take a look at what appears to be a very active weather pattern. In this video, we're going to break down which regions may be seeing multiple snowstorms and which ones may be looking at an early spring. Stick around for information you're not going to get anywhere else. We'll break down everything that you aren't hearing on the media and talk about what you need to know as we head through the final month of winter. Before we dive in here, consider subscribing. I am a degreed meteorologist, but of course we do these updates all the time, just for fun on the side. But let's jump into the forecast that we're getting from NOAA. Then I'll give you my thoughts on what I believe is going to happen relative to what they're forecasting. And you're looking at a pretty typical La Nina pattern here from the Climate Prediction Center, where they're expecting that colder than average weather across the north and northwest, and that warmer than average pattern across the south and the east. That's not really a surprise. If you caught our winter outlook back in November, we were talking about this all along, so you've been pretty far ahead of the game on that one. Precip, also very typical of La Nina conditions. You have that higher than average precip across the northwest. You have a bit of a bullseye out here, as they're forecasting at least, in the Ohio Valley, and generally drier conditions in the south. Haven't quite seen that play out so far this winter, but again, pretty typical of La Nina, so it's what we'd expect. Now, that forecast was made 2 weeks ago. We can take a look at their most recent forecast through the middle of February, and as you can tell, hasn't changed that much. Still expecting from the Climate Prediction Center at least colder than average weather in the northwest, and warmer than average weather across much of the south and the east coast. And as we look at the precip, they're forecasting that northwest region to be pretty wet, and the we'll call it the Great Lakes region to be wetter than average too. Drier than average conditions farther south. But that is, of course, just from the Climate Prediction Center. I want to give you my ideas. That's why you're watching this video anyway, I'd assume. We're going to start here with the European ensembles, and this will give us a look through at least the first half of February. Then we'll talk about the rest of the month here. But what I want to show you is exactly how I believe that upper air pattern is going to play out, and this is very telling of the entire month here. And as I move this forward, what you're looking at are the air masses in play. Anywhere you're seeing those red colors, those are warmer than average air masses. Blue colors are colder than average air masses. And it's very likely we begin the month with what we call zonal flow. And you're going to see this actually throughout the entire month. So I want you to keep an eye out for this theme. You see these black lines here, and you see how they're very straight. When those lines are straight, those are lines of pressure. When those lines are straight, that means our jet stream is pretty flat and just zipping along. And when the jet stream is flat and moving quickly, you get these very active patterns because all of the storm systems that form can really move very quickly and one after the other through the country. So you don't really get locked into any patterns. You just stay active. That said, it also favors quick hitting storm systems. Nothing super powerful. That said, you can see a lot of them, and that can add up. Now, as we move into the middle of the month, we have this ridge that starts to develop out east, and a lot of our weather models keep the ridge there for most of the month. But what I'm looking at is actually at least a periodic week or so in the middle of the month where that ridge does slide away, and I do expect there will be windows for snow back into some areas on the, we won't call it super far south, but on the southern edge of a lot of the data you're seeing. So again, I believe we could see snow as far south as, Kentucky, even Tennessee, once again at some point this winter. But it may be a narrow window if we can get a storm to form there. After that, though, you're going to notice that ridge does begin to come back. And generally speaking, we are seeing what will be cooler and perhaps wetter conditions in the northwest and those drier conditions up the east coast. The areas that we're seeing the biggest changes from that forecast stuff from the Climate Prediction Center, in my opinion, I'm not completely sold on really seeing super wet conditions out in the northeast. I believe there could be several storm systems, but it depends on how strong this ridge is out here. That said, it does look like it'll be pretty mild on the east coast. I'm also going to show you another one of our weather models here. We're going to take a look at what is a look at the entire month on average. And what you're seeing is a pretty similar look here. And this is on the CanSIPS, as we say. It's the Canadian model. And what you're getting right now on the forecast, and I agree with this when I think it depicts what we were talking about very clearly, you have these generally colder and likely wetter than average conditions in the northwestern U.S. Although I'll say I don't expect this to extend so much into the north central. I expect that this is going to be playing out pretty dominantly in the north and west and into portions of western Canada too. But you see the same picture here as well, where your jet stream is very flat. And that's going to owe to a lot of quick-hitting, weaker storm systems. I'm not expecting any massive snow blitzes this month at all. And I also have to say, I do agree that we're likely to see, again, generally warmer than average conditions, especially up the East Coast. So if we're looking for big snowstorms, Got to really time that out very well. Now, we can also take another look at one of our other weather models here. This is also a seasonal model, and this will give us an idea of the average temperature anomalies. That colder than average weather is likely to stay in Canada. I mentioned it before. I do believe we will see that dip into the northwest, and I actually do believe we're going to see that colder than average weather in the north central U.S. as well. But does it line up with the precipitation? That's the question, because that determines how much snow we may see. I'll also say the southern U.S. as a whole looks a lot more spring-like, and the East Coast, at least the coastline here, not the entire Northeast, but the coastline out here, I believe, is going to be on the more mild side. So, again, this part of the country, I wouldn't really call it an early spring in the Northeast, but I could definitely see it coming off as an early-ish spring, we'll call it, in parts of the South out here. And this model here, this data, I think depicts that very well. We can also take a look at the precip anomaly, and you can kind of get an idea where the NOAA was making their forecast off of. They were definitely looking at this pretty closely. And I do agree, I have to say, with the forecast for wetter than average conditions in the Northwest. I fully expect that, and we've been seeing that begin to come into motion recently. At the same time, I'm not completely sold, like I said, on the much wetter than average conditions in the Great Lakes region. I could see the interior of the Northeast being wetter than average, but I'm not convinced that this area is going to be as extreme in terms of wetter than average weather. It does, however, look like the South, especially down towards the Southeast, is going to be drier on the other hand. So depends what region you're looking at there. We can also take a look coming up here at some more information on the temperatures and how wet or dry it's going to be. And we're also going to dive a little closer into the snowfall forecast. So let's jump in and take a look at what's ahead in terms of winter weather before the winter ends. So here we have a look at the European weeklies. This gives us an idea of where that warmer than colder weather may be as we go through the month each week. And as you can see, as we start off February, as we begin the month, we're looking at what is likely to be that warmer than average weather across a good chunk of the eastern U.S. That doesn't really come as a surprise, but we are going to be seeing a lot of volatility in our weather. I believe the first half of this month, we're going to see a lot of quick warm-ups and then quick cool-downs as our weather stays active. So I wouldn't get too used to persistent weather through the first week of the month, but we should settle into a more stable pattern later on. So here we are now in the second week. That's where that cold air really begins to show up out in the northwest and north central. I believe this does extend out here a little farther as well. You can see the warmth in the south. Later in the month, that shouldn't change too much. Still looking at what will be colder than average weather across these northwestern, north central areas. And there's that milder than average weather across the south and east, and that should be the case as we go through the very end of the month here as well, and eventually move into March. So sort of what we've been talking about. In terms of precipitation anomalies, we can get an idea of where the most rain and snow, this is both combined, may be. And we are certainly seeing in the very beginning of the month, our pattern is still a bit unsettled. Could be a decent bit of rain out here in the south, and that will migrate to the north and east. But as we get into the second week of the month, that's when we see our pattern really begin to settle. Again, you're seeing a very strong signal for above average rainfall or snowfall in the north and west. And you're seeing that pattern for wetter than average conditions in the east. And while I don't completely disagree with it, like I said, I'm not certain it will be very extreme, but I could see along this corridor here, perhaps, wetter than average conditions. I'm not convinced it's going to hug the East Coast. As we get later into the month, that forecast stays pretty similar. You're still seeing the wetter than average conditions in the northwest. I do not believe the north central U.S. will be wetter than average, however. So while it may be cold, I wouldn't expect it to be particularly snowy. Still, we have that forecast for wetter than average conditions sort of in those same areas I was talking about, and that'll take us into March as well. And last but not least, we all want to know about the snowfall. With the colder and wetter conditions in the north and west, I do expect snowfall is going to be greater than average through much of the northwest. Mainly those mountains. Could be a significant February for mountains out there. As far as things go farther to the east, remember we have slightly wetter than average conditions and warmer than average conditions. That does not fare well for the coast. Of course, if you're in the south and you're hoping for some snow late season, unless you get it in the first week or so, does not fare well for anything in the south. I do expect if we are going to see snowier than average conditions, it's going to have to be in the interior of the northeast. I would not expect to see much along the coastline relative to our averages. And as we move into the second week of February, you can actually see our weather model pointing out what I'm telling you about right here too. I also mentioned before, but I'll say it again, despite the colder than average weather in the north central U.S., I don't expect it's going to be particularly snowy. It looks quite dry to me. As we move farther into February, you're going to see that signal pretty much maintains. If anything, we do have perhaps some drier weather coming in the second half of the month as temperatures warm up, or I should say less snowy, not necessarily drier. And you're seeing that in some of the orange colors showing up here across a larger tier of the country. So if you want your snow and you are in the Northeast, there's always a possibility in February, but chances do wane the farther and farther we go into the month as it appears. And this should take us into March as well. So to summarize everything we just talked about, the Northwest looks best for above average snowfall, especially in those mountains. And it looks very wet on the coastlines too. Very active weather occurring out there. No matter where you are in the South, it does appear drier and warmer, so I wouldn't expect snow. In fact, if anything, it looks like an early spring-like feel, especially in the southern plains. The north-central U.S. looks cold, but on the drier side of things, if you're on the East Coast, I'm not very bullish on snowfall, even if you see above average precipitation, because it does look mild. But if you're on the interior in the Northeast, especially in those higher elevations, this could be a good back half of ski season, as precipitation, again, will be average or a little bit above average. And we're expecting that cold air to at least hang around some of those areas. So I certainly do like it if you're on the interior. But there's your forecast for February. Of course, we're going to be back here with regular weather updates. You'll want to subscribe, ask any questions in these comments as we keep you up to date through this month, and look at the active weather, the quick moving weather systems that we'll be tracking over the next 4 weeks.